Welcome to Recombination Nation. Today I have an extraordinary guest who has spearheaded the restoration of an entire food system and food culture in a part of the world that has some parallels with my little corner of Australia. So I'm very interested to hear about his Professor David Shields' uh, struggles and triumphs on this front because I think we can all learn an enormous amount from it. So, as a brief overview, I've listened to many interviews and presentations from David Shields about his work rediscovering and restoring an old landrace form of rice that was grown in Southern Carolina and that was nearly lost. And that was just the beginning of all of the amazing things that he's revived. And there's so much more to this story. So I'll quickly throw over to David to tell us a bit more about his particular life journey and how he ended up on this particular path. Was it something that you anticipated early on, or was it pure serendipity?
No, um, I've had an interesting academic path. I originally was a material culture historian doing historical archaeology as an undergraduate, and it was a moment when archaeology became obsessed with artifacts incidence equations and became cliometric and fixated on numbers. And they lost the capacity to tell stories. So I decided I would do something else. I became a historian of print culture. I studied uh, entire bodies of texts and wrote a dissertation on the history of diary writing, asking the question, how can the most private form of writing have become conventionalized so quickly in the absence of a manual of instruction or a particular teacher in this kind of practice? And I wrote numbers of books on various aspects of usually early American, that is, from the 15th century to the early 19th century texts. And strangely enough, I when I got tenure, I became concerned that my life would be contained in 6 inches of a library shelf. I wanted something more. So I decided I would develop an expertise for each one of my senses, and they would not be necessarily associated with one another. And if I got, thwarted with one, I'd go to the other. So I did that and have published books on the history of photography, and I have obsessions and have been a great collector of Russian piano music and things like that. But uh, one of the things I did was I took my study of agricultural literature, um, writings concerned with rural life, seed catalogs, and that was part of my book history type of interests. I liked reading the entire published production of certain sub-discourses of published English work. And people got hold of that. And in 2000 or so, a man named Glenn Roberts, who was a CEO of Anson Mills, one of the great millers of heirloom grains in the United States, told me that he wanted to bring back Carolina gold rice, particular subtropical japonica rice that had grown and become world famous after the American Revolution and through the 19th century, and had gone extinct around 1914 to 1918. And he wanted to bring back all of the other ingredients of the growing system of that rice. This rice was grown in the coastal plain of South Carolina, a place called the Low Country It extends from Jacksonville, North Carolina, down to Jacksonville, Florida, and extends about 100 miles in. And it's a tidal region, very flat, where you can build impoundments for rice. And by a remarkable happenstance in the 1780s, a man named Hezekiah Mayhem in Berkeley County, South Carolina, after the war. The war was particularly vicious in South Carolina, and rice seed production had been destroyed. He gets a hold of a, a rice variety that has a gold husk, and we don't know where he got it from. We know genetically that it is a tropical japonica. It probably comes from the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia years and years back, but those rices got into Africa 1,000 years ago, so it may have been an African source. But at any rate, he started growing this rice, and everyone who tasted it thought, this is a remarkable rice. It had this extraordinary starch bloom in the mouth, and it tasted more wholesome. And so it gets immediately adopted and becomes a sort of engine of wealth in um, in the South. It's produced by slave labor. So there's a human cost to its production. But this rice in a long grain form wins the great gold medal in London and then in Paris in the 1850s and becomes the highest priced rice in the world rice market. It's imported by China. It is exported by the English government is buying tons of rice seed of Carolina Gold to improve the rice varieties in India in this 1870s. So it's a fascinating rice. But by the early 20th century, it had become so expensive to produce under a free labor market that it ceased being produced until numbers of people in the end of the 20th century said, let's bring it back. And Glenn was among that group. And he turned to me and said, you do research. We don't know exactly what was lost in this growing system. Could you do it, find out for us? And actually, I was kind of stupid then. I should have, being a literary scholar, I should have realized I was wandering into the deal with the devil scenario. I was figuring, hey, a month in the library, I'll come up with a list and I'll get free restaurant dinners for a year in Charleston or one of the other big cities in the region. And what happened was, I got in and started reading really deeply in this literature and realized I was profoundly ignorant. I couldn't understand why they were making certain decisions in terms of their crop rotations, in their processing, why. Uh, uh, Long story short, I spent 3 years educating myself. Glenn and I and other people formed a foundation, and that foundation, the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation, went out and we had the list of the 45 essential, elements of the Carolina Rice Kitchen, and we spent the next 20 years looking for them. And we discovered all but two.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, so we were quite good and about that. And what's interesting about that, most of the essential crops had been functionally extinct by the time we started looking for them. They'd been all supplanted by agronomic crops bred in the last half of the 20th century. And it was an interesting moment culinarily too, because In the 1970s, Alice Waters, a famous chef out in the West Coast, started a movement. She said American food isn't about French sauces, it is about American ingredients. And so restaurants in various places, chefs said, yeah, we'll get on the bandwagon. And chefs and restaurants in Charleston and Savannah along the southeast coast of the United States said, let's do it. And had all of the old recipes available to them. They slotted the locally available ingredients in, and the oldest generation of consumers said, you know, there's something missing here. It's the flavor.
Mm.
And when the chefs asked, well, how can that be? We're using all the local stuff, and the rice that they were using was cacodri, a modern long grain white rice. The corn that they were using was number two yellow dent. You know,
Yeah.
they had chosen one of the sad things about grain breeding in the last half of the 20th century and the first decade of the 21st was that no sensory evaluation was done of the particular varieties that were created. And they were created for very specific purposes, that is, greater production, greater disease resistance, greater drought resistance, pest resistance. They even tested for cookie dough spread
Uh,
of certain wheat varieties, but they didn't taste for flavor.
mhm.
And that, of course, is so wrong because, the real story of grains in antiquity was that they were um, they were improved by the people that grew them, and usually consuming whole grain porridges. They weren't baking breads with them, and they tweaked the flavor. And it wasn't so much like nuttiness that they were going for. It, there's another language associated with flavor around the concept of wholesomeness. And wholesomeness is actually what food does for your body over a longer term ingestion period. You know, sweet, sour, bitter, umami, that's all the instant sensation. But wholesomeness talks about energy charge or satiation or getting some sort of sense of power or medicinal effect. I mean, you take the medicine, you have to wait for the effects. So that's a really interesting thing. Grains have this history of being selected for long-term ingestion effect
Mm. Well,
more than
I wonder in
instant
the
flavor.
I wonder in that pre-industrial era that the ability to select and prepare food correctly to maintain health was critical because there was so much disease pressure compared to today. If you were not keeping your family in top health, it could have disastrous consequences.
Yes, and you know, I'm sure that historically there are pressures that we're not cognizant of. I mean, you read the stories in the Bible of Samson tying torches to the tails of foxes to burn down the fields. The capacity of grains to resist destruction in wartime is something we don't talk about, but we do talk about straw strength and um, the ability to of land-raised grains to withstand lodging, that is blowdown from storms and things like that. And that necessarily was probably part of their mass selection as well.
Mm.
So those were sort of like the interesting ideas floating around.
I really love that I get a chance to talk to people who come to this whole area of like landrace crops that often have really unexpected backgrounds. And I'm really curious how your kind of origin in literature and history gave you special perspectives and advantages that I don't think other people have necessarily brought to this whole movement. What do you think about that?
Well, one of the things that it does is there is such a thing as book farming. And book farming became really important in America in the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century because most people who farmed during the colonial era, their ancestors had come to a land that was so fertile, that had not been subjected to nutrition extraction on a large scale ever, except in Central America. And so they did not rotate crops. They did not fallow. And for 100 and some years, the crops in the field kept producing. And then inevitably, the nutrition was sucked out of the soil. And so all of a sudden, people are looking to Europe and the literature, that reading, you see the planters buying stuff like Geoponica, the story of soil and how do you inject nutrition back into soil, and people starting to think about chemistry, and your dad's farming no longer counts anymore because it's produced a disaster. So all of a sudden we have, books telling you. But the problem with book farming is that when you actually grow crops, there are always things that crop up that are never in the books.
Yeah.
You know, terrible things occur and you don't know why. They're mysterious conditions. Uh, One of the things that we have to think about, in land races is the epigenetic effect of taking a land race that developed in one region and putting it into a place with different soil, different water, different day length, different climate. It turns into a different plant.
Mm.
And the question is, can we use that plant or can't we? I like to think of, collards, which are, a brassica that are well beloved in the South, but they were actually, the colonists wanted heading cabbages, and when they took the heading cabbage seed and tried to save it, they brought the seed over from Germany or from England, and they grew it, saved some seed. The second generation, it wouldn't form heads.
Yeah.
So you had these leafy things which they tasted good, but they weren't the original thing. Same thing happens with certain of the grains. So those are some of the issues that you face. And I guess Australia must have faced the same sort of thing. But at any rate, literary knowing the books as well as registering what actually happens makes you exquisitely aware of certain types of issues that have to be confronted if you're going to make grains work or other vegetables work, particularly if they're grown as staples.
Mm. Well, I want to briefly touch on this idea of the historic literature around agriculture. And whenever I find a book which has any level of detail about pre-industrial agricultural systems, I jump on it because they're so rare. But even the information in them is difficult to translate back out into the real world. And I wonder if it's almost like the wrong medium for storing and transmitting this information. It's like writing a book about ballet. Like you could, if you tried to recreate a tradition of ballet dancing just from a book without ever actually seeing it or having somebody watch you and give you guidance, Is there a similar issue with agriculture that it's actually too nuanced or too embodied to get into an
Yeah,
abstract form?
I think, well, it's very difficult to think of anyone who decides to farm exclusively on the basis of a book.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
they're usually the people turn to agricultural literature, and in the United States, 1819 is the year when the crisis year, when all of a sudden people realize that the system is falling apart, that they've got to learn how to replenish the soil. And so they start publishing journals and things like that. But they already have a kind of practical knowledge that is failing them.
mm,
So the books operate in a kind of conversation with a practice that you're embedded in. And even now, I, I think we exist in a really interesting moment in that YouTube videos are the great instructional medium for farmers these days.
mm,
Um, if you have to repair your machine and you don't know exactly what's the problem or you have to replace a part, you look at the YouTube video. If you're having a particular pest problem that you're not familiar with, and the YouTube video. So that the visual dimension is really good in YouTube videos, but they lose the chemistry, the entomology, whatever, there's a lot that doesn't get conveyed that print always did a good job of. And
mm.
even now, you read a seed packet, there's a lot of information there that's really necessary for you to operate with.
Now, I also wanted to talk a bit more about your bioregion and the challenges that it faces in terms of sustainable agriculture. Does it have any unique pressures?
Well, yes, I mean, it's a humid, extraordinarily fertile zone, which is turning increasingly tropical. And the uh, the incidence of new viruses and diseases is breathtaking, uh, and a lot of the landrace crops can be vulnerable to these things. It's true that, one of the things that happens with viruses once they're established on a landscape is that the various breeders are breeding, resistance into them, and then the virus sort of is mutating in order to infect that old host again. And you get the Red Queen effect, where the oldest plants are confronted by viruses in a field which have evolved away from their sort of genetic configuration so they don't affect them. So there is a kind of slippage that landrace can have if you're growing a landrace of a particular category that has been grown traditionally on a field.
Yep, that
Now,
makes
another
sense.
problem is that we have like rice cultivation has been going on for centuries in certain of these fields. And there's always a problem in rice of the outmutation to red rice. Red rice is a weedy rice, non-productive, and it will take over your field. So your field will in effect be contaminated. Um, we also have problems with saltwater intrusion along the coast. Um, Hurricanes have become increasingly more intense. So one of the great challenges that we have is seed security. We've had our reserve of rice seed. destroyed on two occasions, an entire year of reserve through hurricanes that went through Texas.
Mm.
Um, so one of the things we learn is um, you store your seed in multiple locations and try to make at least one of those locations not close to the hurricane zones.
Do you think that's one of the key advantages of annual grain crops, that they have a capacity for rapid scalability, that you can take a small saved store of seed and in a small number of generations scale that up to feed very large numbers of people. Whereas perennial crops like tree crops are often touted as being the future, but in response to a disaster like a hurricane, you could be looking at a generation before they're back online.
Right. I'm totally on board with that line of thought. And we have in the United States a group of grain people who say Kernza, perennial uh, grain is the answer, and it's part of the permaculture ideology. But what strikes me about the history of grains is that they were improved. They or seed selection tweaked the flavor to make it more wholesome all the time. Um, Grains are not, sort of like stable entities that reproduce the same year after year. They're biodynamic and they're constantly being, maintained and improved. Sometimes they have to be rehabbed if they mutate in the wrong direction. So you have to be nimble. You have to exploit the genetic diversity of the land race. We do have a problem in the United States in that we have like a narco uh, land race group that, their idea is let's grab all of these land races, different varieties of a certain crop like corn, plant them all together, let them cross-pollinate, plant that stuff, see which one does the best under the circumstances, grow as rapidly, is most prolific, and those sorts of things. And the problem, of course, is that that's usually done without flavor, as they don't test that. They're interested in how it actually performs in the field.
Mm.
And the, there were reasons why varieties were stabilized. There was a predictability attached to landrace forms.
Yeah, diversity without selection is an interesting academic exercise, but in terms of actual end uses, you actually need to use it to make it useful, is the way I like to put it. Oh, that brings up a question. Were pre-industrial cultures better at matching diverse opportunities for crops to local ecological niches? Like the industrial system kind of swept away all of that diversity and just imposed, mechanical commodity scale uniformity. But if we're trying to rebuild that past dynamic, are there tricks that we can learn? Like, how did people get the right crops in the right place when they had, a fraction of the resources we have available today?
Right. Um, that's a kind of interesting anthropological question. And my inclination is to think that certain things were done very well. Um, we depend a lot less on forage in our eating system now than pre-industrial or pre-modern societies did. There were issues that they understood certain dimensions of the crops better than we do because we have a greater variety of crops that we pay attention to. We have a smaller range of things that we depend on. I like to think about, how I've been interacting with a number of Native American firekeepers, the people who are responsible for maintaining ash in the societies. And the ash was used to nixtamalize maize, which enabled niacin uptake. And so you didn't have the niacin deficiency disease, pellagra, which afflicted many poor Southerners who ate corn as the staple because they didn't lie treated. They took the ash and fertilized their crops with it. They sometimes intermingled it with certain doughs for certain effects in terms of, you know, um, the wholesomeness or the pharmacological efficacy of what they were preparing. And that kind of knowledge, remains a kind of preserve of traditional communities around the world. Um, I would say, we tend to ascribe to like Native Americans or indigenous peoples all around the world a kind of stability in what they did. But change also operates there as well. I mean, new crops come in, interactions with other native cultures. Um, I'm particularly interested in the question of when sweet potatoes, which are South American and in the West Indies, make inroads on the mainland North American tribes who are eating Apios americana and the wild potato, which both of which are not as sweet, not as nutritious, and tend to be smaller and more difficult to harvest because they form on long underground strings that go on the ground, while sweet potatoes form in masses right under the plant. And that apparently shows up almost immediately before European settlement. And you can see that native peoples almost instantaneously embrace it as being superior to what they're doing. They
Mm.
they maintain the old stuff, but all of a sudden, sweet potato rises to the top. So they're really interesting historical questions.
Well, I mean, the spread of maize further into North America was quite. It only happened a short time before European colonization in many places. The Buffalo Bird Woman account has
Yeah,
hints of that, and it's such an interesting snapshot of that agricultural and cultural change that we're potentially going to face in our future as well. I
yes,
wonder,
and
getting back to that question of how pre-industrial culture seemed so good at putting the right crops in the right places. Maybe it's a question of speed and complexity. So, like somebody who's interested today could order like 1,000 different strains from the GRIN seed bank, but then how could one person hope to give the attention to actually select from that enormous amount of diversity? Because you would have to actually eat each of those in a deliberate, conscious way at least once. Um,
right.
and the compromise seems to be let's just let them all hybridize and then start selecting from that.
I, one of the things I am convinced about is, the answer of modern industrial cultivation is we don't actually need to know a lot. If we sterilize the soil and grow the grain with a chemical supplementation package, which has a sort of narrow range of things that we're giving to it, and we know the effects of those things. And the problem, of course, is that the real benefit of land races isn't necessarily an economic benefit, but a nutritive benefit. They have much more highly ramified root systems that pump sugar into the soil, promote mycorrhizal growth that spreads out, extends the root system to draw up more micronutrients created by the microbes in the soil. So, you have an heirloom oat like the Virginia winter turf oat, which is 25 degrees 25% protein, while modern crop oats, hovering around 15, 16%. I mean, and the flavor is so much more superior because they're more complex. I
Mm.
mean, the micronutriments have this capacity to give a wide spectrum complexity to taste.
That definitely seems to be the rate limiting step for a lot of attempts at creating new land races from diverse genetics. Is it's the actual human interaction, the human attention that is limiting. So I don't know. I
Yeah,
guess
and the quality of the soil.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
you have to know the soil that you're growing stuff in to make sure that the plant has the greatest potential to draw out the nutrition from that soil.
yeah.
And that's one of the things that native um, seed people, uh, the Cherokees had a particular clan that was devoted to these issues, the Wild Potato Clan. And they did the breeding, they paid attention to the soil, they made sure that proper fertilization was going on and things like that. And so, I mean, one of the more interesting dimensions of modern agriculture is that you do have really sophisticated soil scientists, but they're almost systematically neglected by industrial seed companies and chemical companies because they don't want living soil. They don't want tilth.
Mm.
They don't want earthworms in the field.
Yeah, yeah. That's the disconnect is it's breathtaking. I did want to talk to you about a couple of your specific crops that I don't think I've heard mentioned as much in interviews. Could we start with a little outline of the bene, the sesame? Am I pronouncing that correctly?
That's right. Bene, Bene is the low oil that's around 45% oil, tan seeded landrace sesame that came from West Africa during the colonial era. And the entire plant has uses. The leaves were um, a a leaf was put in a glass of cold water and it would form mucilage that would calm any sort of bowel irritation that you had. It was an antacid. The green pods were eaten as a vegetable. They were mucilaginous like okra. The seeds were used in a complex series of dishes, like the mash seeds were used in conjunction with greens, in conjunction with yams, in conjunction with fonio and the um, sorghum grain porridges and finger millets that were eaten. And now, of course, the sesame seed is used in baking and confection. But the real value of it, I thought, was in terms of oil. It's a high smoke point. In the colonial period, the attempts to grow olives in the southeast were not successful at all. I mean, Australia strikes me as a country much more suited because it has areas which lack humidity for the cultivation of olives. Is there an olive industry in
Yes.
Australia?
Yeah. A bit inland from me. I'm on the coast where it's a little bit too warm and humid for olives to be reliable.
But so the lipids were usually bacon fat, rendered tallow. And of course, those are expensive. You have to raise an animal in order to get that.
Mm.
So here was an oil seed that tasted good, had a high smoke point, and you had all of these other uses for it as well. And so uh, we we were interested in bringing back the landrace sesame because modern sesame is too bitter.
Mm.
and it's too oily. It's 60% oil. It's non-shattering. That is, the pods don't burst their seeds out like the traditional ones do. That presents a kind of problem in terms of harvesting Bene. What happens is because the pods ripen from the bottom of the plant to the top, when the first ones ripen, you cut the plant off, stick it in a tote bag upside down with a whole bunch of other plants, let them dry down for a month and a half, and then whack them. And then all the pods will burst at one time, the seeds will collect in the bottom, and you burn the sticks. So that's a little labor intensive for modern seed extraction agriculture, but the flavor of traditional Bene and its oil is so much better than modern strains of Bene, which are, as I say, bitterer and 60% oil.
Do the landrace crops of your region tend to be taller growing as well to give them more competitiveness with weeds once they're established?
Well, the green grains are,
Hmm.
but there are other classes of plants that are land races, like peanuts or field peas, Vigna unguiculata, or certain brassicas, which grow lower, and where you see the different elaboration is again below ground in the root systems.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, another oil crop you mentioned briefly then was peanuts. I'm curious about the unusual variety that you managed to get back into circulation.
Yes, the original peanuts, I mean, peanuts are native to South America, but in the 1500s, they were brought by the Portuguese to West Africa. And the West Africans already had a subterranean legume, the bambara, and they boiled them. But a bambara only has one kernel per subterranean pod. Peanuts had two. So the Africans embraced them immediately. And then, through the slave trade, a century later, they come from West Africa into North America. And the type of peanut that they brought is a small peanut with very fine oil quality. It was called the Carolina African runner peanut. Runner because its habit of growth ran flat along the ground. It was a vining peanut. And it was used, exported for oil, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. And then it gets supplanted by the Valencia, or the small Spanish peanut, which produces four kernels per pod. So you're doubling it up versus the two. The two are a little larger than, the Spanish peanuts. And the other peanut that grows is a Bolivian peanut that was used for roasting and was secured in the 19th century by Virginians. And it's called the Virginia peanut in America, not the Bolivian peanut. And it's the type that you find roasted in roasted peanut stands and in tins throughout the grocery world.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, yeah.
Now,
Oh, yes.
bringing that crop back has produced all sorts of problems. If I were to say what of these restorations has been the most troublesome and most prone to failure, this is it. The mechanical equipment for harvesting peanuts is all adjusted to either smaller or larger. Uh, they are particularly vulnerable to sort of mosaic spot disease. Um, and while they tend to be prolific, they still require more care and more labor than any other peanut that's being grown. So the agronomics of the situation are sort of militating against this. And the people that grow it now tend to be historic sites or people, African Americans who have heritage gardens and want to have the actual flavors of the ancestors.
Mm, mm. Have well, for these kind of landrace crops that are experiencing some difficulty, do you think some of them are in need of further development and breeding to like take that foundation historically and update them to modern
Oh, yes. I
conditions?
think that and indeed that is going on right now. There's a woman named Jenna Hirschberger here who is taking all of the classic Southern lima beans or butter beans and imparting disease resistance without changing the configuration, the flavor, the configuration of the root system.
Mm,
And that's also happening in greens as well. The classic old Florida flat-leafed mustard, classic huge mustard variety that was grown throughout the South as a pot green. Um, uh, Mark Farnham, a USDA geneticist and plant hunter, and the people down at the Clemson Research Center in Charleston have been breeding a disease-resistant form of it.
hmm
So that I think that is entirely legit. Um, I do think necessarily you want to keep an unmodified strain available, to serve as since some of these plants have come down for thousands of years, um, as the basic legacies of certain cultures, those should be honored. But in order for them to actually be useful food plants and people to receive the maximum nutritive benefit from them, some sort of improvement has to go on.
mm, mm. I wondered if you have any perspective or advice for a part of the world like Australia going through this process. Just as a quick bit of history, the first 100 years we were a net food importer. We basically got, you know, flour and sugar from the Brits in return for gold nuggets and finest fleeces and rare timbers. And after that, we pretty much industrialized before we had a chance to really generate the heritage that your part of the world had for at least a century or two. And trying to like we don't really have anything to restore per se. We're kind of in a weird position of trying to create something post-industrial and pre-industrial at the same time as
Uh,
a parallel to our very industrial food system.
Well, I mean, I think of certain of the heirloom wheats that exist on the west coast of the United States, which actually came from Australia, which came from Europe, a
Mm,
white soft wheat that I'm sure began its life as a white llamas wheat out of Europe, and that is a true heirloom that exists in Australia. That also exists. It exists in Europe. It exists in Australia. And it exists on the west coast of North America.
mm.
And in California, they're quite proud to point to that Australian lineage.
Yeah, there's definitely there are wheat belts in the more temperate like Mediterranean climates, but for a place I think there's parallels between where I am in a subtropical coastal zone with your pocket of the world, except ours is so small and was colonized so recently it never really developed an agricultural heritage other than just putting bananas and pineapples on everything for export and
Right.
making them grow with superphosphate. That was all of our heritage really.
But it's interesting to think about the categories of grains. And for instance, rye really interests me because rye is the most viable of
Mm,
all of the wheat varieties, you know. Some of the landrace ryes, like the black seeded ryes, will grow on a sand dune.
hmm mm,
So if you didn't have absolutely fertile soil, um, rye would be the one crop that you could be sure would make.
mm,
And there are ryes that, you know, one of the two plants that we didn't find that we wanted to find in our growing system was a white mammoth rye. That was the original rye whiskey rye of Appalachia.
mm,
And we know that that rye came from Russia originally. It was given to the American ambassador to Russia, Joel Barlow, who conveyed it to the United States. It started being grown in Kentucky and places like that. It was called, for reasons I can't figure out, Egyptian rye.
oh,
But it, but it was later rebranded White Mammoth Rye, and huge panicles. Stops being grown during Prohibition. The last recorded instance of its cultivation is in Canada in 1990. So
mm,
I'm convinced that seed must exist somewhere. But, you know, when I think about it, there is one white rye from Estonia. That's an old land race called Sangaste, Sangaste. It has seed heads that are a foot long. The grains themselves, you know, verge on sometimes a half inch in length. I mean, this is a huge rye.
wow.
And it was used for vodka manufacture. And one of the things I wonder is that Estonia was in the larger Russian Empire in the uh, early 19th century. I wonder if Sangaste is related to the lost white mammoth rye. But if you want a rye to sort of look at that has all sorts of potential, you know, it has good straw quality. It is a classic land race. It's big, big, big.
Mm.
And you know, it's viable. That'd be what I look at, Sangaste.
I'll have to dig into that. And we're lucky we do have a an Australian grain gene bank that people can uh, attempt to get material out of. That you need to convince
Right.
them that you're
I was looking
serious.
for a watermelon there a
Oh,
number
okay.
of years ago.
Ah,
So Odell's white watermelon. So,
ah,
and there's a mulberry that came out of the South called Hicks mulberry,
mm,
which is an everbearing, you know, drops fruit for 3 months that was used as a feed tree in Australia, but much more in New Zealand. And New
hmm.
Zealand still maintains it, but I think there must be trees growing in Australia as well.
I think I've heard of that variety around. Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you in general what you think about the utility and the vulnerability of those seed banks around the world. Do you feel a sense of urgency to get as much of that material back into communities? Um,
You know, um, are you thinking about the political peril
yeah,
that
yeah. I
they
mean,
could
just
be in? You know,
it's
it
ultimate
is an
expression.
interesting
It's
thing to
yeah,
think
you're putting
about.
all those eggs in one basket that it only takes a meteorite or something to hit it, let alone a government defunding a shift in political priorities.
Right. In the United States, there is a kind of model for seed saving called, you know, the Seed Savers Exchange or the Southern Seed Exchange. And the idea is that the seeds, once they go into the central repository, are immediately shunted back out to other people to grow out and stuff like that. The one problem with that is that there's no robust conversation among the seed maintainers and the people that grow out about what the future configuration of the seed will be.
Hmm.
There's no consensus about what you're improving toward. And the one thing you have to say about scientifically maintained seed banks that do viability grow outs is that they've documented the existing traits and they have an idea of what a plant should at least have as a minimum going forward, and they
Mm.
try to maintain that. So, um, I see neither system being ideal, but the maintenance of a sort of dual system like that, having both seed saver exchange and central repositories with a duplication of material, and regional. One of the problems is having a national repository is that certain plants only do well in certain regions.
Yeah.
So it should be dispersed, multiple parts of a collection in parts of a country that matter.
Particularly if the epigenetics of the grow out conditions are a key aspect of what makes that variety unique. If you just
Right.
grow it out every decade in a test plot in completely different soil and conditions to what it was meant to thrive in, you could be losing something subtle there that, all the you can read the genome and it looks the same, but
Or
something's
not very
changed.
subtle. I mean, you
Yeah.
just lose
Yeah, you lose
lose
genes
the
as well.
gumption of the plant. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, oh, have any of your attempted restoration projects hit a brick wall? Like what have been the barriers to getting any of them off the ground?
Well, you know, just generally, the biggest challenge is seed,
Hmm.
how to maintain the purity of seed. And how is that policed? And if you're going to do grains, it only pays to do grains at a certain scale.
Mm.
I mean, it's true that there's certain types of grains that lend themselves to patch cultivation. But if you're doing rice, um, if you're doing corn, if you're doing um, oats, you want to have a pretty large acreage involved in order to get it to commercial level and get some money back to the farmer that's growing it. And the question is, who is supplying the grain seed? You have to have some entity that embraces that. And it can be a university, it can be a foundation. The Carolina Gold Rice Foundation is now, we used to depend on the Texas Crop Improvement Association for the production of seed, but um, they have gone out of business. So we are having to take over the production of the seed. Fortunately, we have the geneticists on board to be able to do that. But it's a costly and time-consuming thing, which demands labor and professional, and everyone has, it makes, if there's only one major seed source, all the people who want that seed are going to have to, you know, come into some sort of community so no one monopolizes it.
Mm.
So it's a really interesting question. Um, and
What about access to processing equipment? Because when you have diverse strains of grains, often transforming the raw harvest into an edible product is not a trivial process.
well, that is less of a concern because there are always millers
Hmm.
who are willing to, on consignment, mill someone's production. And they've usually got the capacity to handle whatever is brought to them. And We have Miller producers for many grain varieties, heirloom grain varieties in the United States. Where it gets interesting is what, like, for heirloom corn, some of the people who are most interested in it are bourbon distillers. And they have a different process of handling the corn and different requirements for the state it must be in at harvest. So often the distillers set up a kind of infrastructure and handle the trucking and do all of that. So, yeah, there's always, in the United States, there are things called grain hubs or grain chains, which organize the producers of a region that are doing unusual or non-standard, non-commodity grain varieties. And um, they're usually well connected to bakers
Mm,
or co-packers that want to make specialty things out of it. You know, if you do heirloom fruit, for instance, they'll make jelly out of it or
mm,
uh, dry it down for you or whatever. So it it depends on how robust you have as a processing sector and how nimble they are.
hmm hmm
But the other, I guess, issue is regulation. Um, Governmental entities tend to be very dictatorial, and they don't want like aberrant strains polluting the commodity grain that the population depends on. So you have to be very transparent. And that's where, some of the anarcho breeders, landrace breeders are looked upon with, ultimate suspicion because what if they do create the super landrace corn that takes over but doesn't meet, the
Are there some
the syrup
advantages working with
specification?
orphan species rather than unusual strains of commodity crops?
Yeah. So what are you thinking of in particular?
Well, I mean, for example, I'm dabbling with jobs tiers at the moment.
Oh,
Coex have got a little bit of diversity of that to play with, and it's off the radar in terms of like major producers. So maybe it
right.
makes me
You have to
less of a
get the
concern.
jewelry makers into that because, like the natives, the Cherokees love that plant and they make beadwork out of it. So,
Mm, mm.
yeah,
Um,
the scariest stuff is when you get into uh, plants that are being used by alternative medicine people for pharmacological purposes, and they don't vet the plants with any official
oh,
entity.
yes, yep. Well, getting back to the idea of like processing and getting into the community, do the historic crops that you're restoring have an advantage because they have a story that goes along with them, whereas a
Yes.
new landrace is kind of just floating free in the culture and it doesn't latch people's imaginations?
Well, a newly created landrace, if it is going to depend on story, is going to have to piggyback over its a progenitor landrace.
Mm.
Like we have a wonderful short season winter wheat called Purple Straw that was the original biscuit and cake and whiskey wheat of the South. Um, it's not hyper productive. It is prone to lodging. It has good straw. Um, and it is vulnerable to certain diseases. So a man named Rick Boyles, who is a wheat breeder, is creating a dwarf stature, you know, um, form of purple straw that is disease resistant. And he's going to call it Purple Straw Plus.
Hmm.
And that way, the original, it advertises the connection and qualities to the original, but it speaks to the farmer who's actually going to buy the seed in that it has the stuff that you need in order for it to survive and prosper in the field.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, the next section I usually talk about is like lower inputs and resilience in production systems. And I'm curious about how the varieties that you've helped restore have been taken up by the local growing and consuming community.
Right. Well, certain things have been taken up well. The Jimmy Red corn, the Cox prolific corn, Seashore black seed rye, um, the Carolina gold rice, and Bene is, widely used. The things that, we haven't, one of the real categorical issues in terms of grains, I think, has to do with oats. Historically, humans only consumed white oats because you could tell whether spoilage had taken place. And colored oats were consigned to animals as animal feed. And but some of those colored oats were resistant to oat rust. So and some of them were tweaked, like that one I was talking about, the gray turf oat. That was bred to be horse rocket fuel, race horses. And so, it comes down to the 20th century, and finally, refrigeration enables non-white oats to be consumed, but it hasn't been the habit of people to
Mm,
do red oats or black oats for that matter, or gray oats. And grays kind of look strange.
mm.
But if you ate a bowl of oatmeal from Turf Oats, it'd be like drinking a six-pack of Red Bull in the morning. You'd be ready for the day.
Win the
You
Kentucky
get your
Derby.
energy. People who are inclined to grow heirloom oats, um, because of the difficulty in terms of processing oats, because of the husks on oats are very clingy, they tend to go for naked oats or peel oats. Um,
Hmm.
and that, uh, so the whole range of those hyperprotein oats isn't really being explored
Mm,
because it's a bother. And there are some really interesting heirloom oat varieties, the old Poland oat, the potato oat, the white Tartarian oat. We've grown the potato oat here in South Carolina. I wish I could say that the flavor was substantially different from like the peel oats that people grow, but they're pretty similar. So,
mm.
and
Well,
I didn't feel like energized by it.
mm. Well, how much the like the slow food movement functioning as kind of like early adopters for these crops to like get them into like get that first bit of refamiliarization happening? And are any of the crops spreading beyond those early adopters?
Oh yeah. What's interesting about slow food is that aside from a group in Colorado, um, the real interest in the arc of taste tends to be either in fruits or vegetables. And you have many more vegetable farmers who are interested in heirlooms than anything else. And like one of the early discoveries in vegetable farming was a tomato called the Cherokee purple tomato. And it became, in the course of like 5 years, from a virtually unknown heirloom to the most widely cultivated heirloom tomato in North America. So there is an instance of an heirloom crop driven by, the arc of taste adoption that became now a commodity.
Mm. Do you think the
Uh,
dramatically different color was a key there, that people got to see it through visual media before
well, I do
they?
think that the appearance was a differentiation, but I think the flavor
Mm,
was immediately recognized as being superior.
mm,
And the flavor was present in virtually every grow out in every region in the United States. It
that
was one of
consistency.
those tomatoes that didn't respond, in a squirrely way to different soil conditions.
Well, what's been the cultural impact of the restored crops reappearing in the local community? Has it had other kind of cultural effects?
You have a, a lot of local pride, and within certain ethnic communities, like one of the things that has happened is Native American um, tribes in the Southeast who lost certain corn varieties have reconnected with them as the result of the research that's been done by people into, what's out there in terms of the land races that survive, and they've rematriated them.
Mm,
And in the instance of the Lumbee, that enabled the revival of their green corn ceremony. So a revitalization of part of the religious culture of the tribe takes place. African Americans, Gullah Geechee cooking is something that's characteristic of the coastal region of the southeast here. And there are individual vegetables like the Sea Island red pea and the purple ribbon sugar cane, which are part of that culture that have been restored and now are considered essential um, to their holiday celebrations or anything which references enduring Gullah Geechee tradition.
mm,
And same thing with Southern food. Um, Restaurants often advertise, their regional focus.
mm.
And that's something that's important. I don't know if that translates to Australia very well, but it certainly is something that exists here.
On that point, we do have a growing indigenous food movement in Australia, which is developing its regional specializations. I'm hoping to help bring bunya nuts, this very old uh, a tree nut species that the Aborigines valued enormously. I'm trying to start
Right.
a restoration project around that. And well, we can move
It's
on to
odd
talk.
that parts of the United States, like Hawaii, pride themselves on the macadamia nut as their regional
Yes.
thing, not realizing it's Australian.
Yes, yeah, and that was domesticated in my backyard in living memory. So I think the bunya nut could go through a similar transformation and be probably 10 times more consequential than even the macadamia nut. But I
Oh,
was curious to
interesting.
talk about the Carolina Golden Rice Foundation, how that was structured and managed, because I'm hoping to create something similar for bunya nuts in my part of the world. So I'm looking for hints and advice about what's worked for other people for comparable projects. So tell me about how that was set up and run.
Well, that was a nonprofit. It was founded by um, an entomologist, a faculty member of Clemson University, who was interested in rice culture globally and had a hand in the reviving Carolina Gold Rice, and Glenn Roberts of Anson Mills, and a handful of other people who were growing rice in South Carolina,
Hmm.
uh, Campbell Cox and others. I was brought in as sort of like the historian and the person who told the stories of things. And one of the important dimensions of the foundation was that it was educational.
Hmm.
Yes, it was seeking out these things and um, reestablishing their cultivation by putting seed in the hands of cultivators. But we went out and talked to chefs, particularly the millers who were associated with the foundation. They talked to chefs, educated them on the ingredients and the um, uh, ways to handle uh, their preparation
Hmm.
and their combination. And I worked on, sort of getting the general history in print. So I published books about this stuff. And there would always be, with every new plant discovery or introduction that we did for those 40 some plants, there'd be newspaper stories, sometimes in the New York Times, sometimes in the Washington Post, sometimes in the Wall Street Journal.
Mm.
Everyone was interested in, hearing about a really important lost plant being rediscovered and how a chef made it resplendent.
Yeah, yeah.
So the culinary connection was always very important.
Well,
And the
on
fact that we had scientists, producers, educator, communicators, and chefs all part of the system was significant.
Yes, yeah, and I've been wondering whether a slow-growing tree crop has structural disadvantages that the time it takes to complete generational cycles and production cycles are so long that I almost wonder if creating a non-profit or something that includes annuals and perennial crops that would create results faster could help like tie that in with the Bunya domestication restoration kind of project. That if it was
Yeah, so
just
I
purely a
mean,
tree crop, it could be too slow for people to be patient enough.
we, I mean, even though Carolina Gold Rice was the nominal focus of our foundation, we became famous for handling a broad spectrum of heirloom crops.
Yeah, yeah.
And so think about in your naming,
Mm.
you might want to
Branch out a bit.
not just have the the nut name, but
Mm.
have a broader reference.
I'll have to think about that. I also wonder if you have any thoughts about when you're starting these kind of organizations, what's the ideal scale in terms of the number of people that you get involved in that early stage?
Um, we had 10, 15 is the maximum that were ever on the board.
Hmm.
And they're all on 3-year cycles with a chance to serve 2 terms.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I think that that's a really interesting question about. I think you should always aim for a odd number so that there won't
Hmm.
be any tie votes.
Yeah.
Um, that's the only practical thing I would say. And have a robust website with video content as well as textual content.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, all good advice that I'll take on board. Um, I also want to explore the possibilities for these restored or like novel landrace crops to gain deeper cultural significance And I'm thinking of the example of comparing a Catholic communion wafer versus a pack of crackers from Walmart. Like they are in no way a comparable uh,
Right.
object. And I wonder if there's a way that heritage crops and slow food and all these kind of things could aim to create some kind of even more profound cultural significance.
Right. Well, sacralizing something is always interesting. Uh, it's, in American culture, the medicalization of something, the transformation of the demand for green tea within the past 20 years when it was discovered that, it had all sorts of beneficial health effects,
Mm,
I think is a really, significant thing. Healthfulness is certainly one way to cause greater resonance. Um, the There are ways in which ingredients can be made into like regional signatures.
hmm
And um, there's a berry that was bred within the last 40 years up in Oregon called the Marion berry.
hmm
If you go to Oregon, there are signs for it everywhere. It's in ice cream, Marionberry pie in every restaurant. Somehow, people wanted something that they could call their own.
hmm
And it was promoted, and did ingenious things, like they held contests, like baking contests, or
hmm
who can do the best thing with, Marionberries. And they'd offer, some spiffy prizes. And all of a sudden, the Marionberry is universal there.
hmm
And th th um, I don't know to what extent the marketing and agricultural entities of the state were enlisted. I know that Oregon State University played a lively part in it, but the commercial producers got on board too. So
mm.
it was something interesting.
Do you see a slow textile movement having an even more powerful cultural impact if people can like wear a garment every day that signifies something about who they are and how they're connected to place? And in that thread, is cotton due for a rehabilitation culturally in your part of the world that its reputation has been kind of marred through its association with industrial slavery?
Right. Well, I mean, Stephen Satterfield on the West Coast, African American, is undergoing a sort of spearheading a cotton revival now. Um, I don't know about clothing because it strikes me as an industry which is perversely subjugated to the manipulation of a very few large design houses and manufacturing entities.
Mm,
It's very difficult to get a grassroots counter movement concerning either cloth or um, a garment. And it's it's really interesting that, in order to do a counter movement, you got to have someone like a sports figure
hmm
be your touter, or uh, I got a new material in my shoes, and these shoes have a different, meaning and stuff like that. Or, I mean, even um, actors and actresses and singers no longer have the power that they once did in order to shape those kinds of fashions.
mm, mm,
You know, I doubt that Lady Gaga could even move the needle on certain things. That said, I wouldn't look to cloth maybe so much as paper.
Ah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I can see that.
So, um, you know, and Japan, of course, shows the way on how to make paper both magnetically compelling in its sensual qualities and also a signature of place.
Yes. Yeah. 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 There's a lot to be learnt from Japan about their cultural preservation that they have done consistently all through industrialization. There's always been that thread. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about your other creative works. I wish I'd had more time to prepare for this. I would have read things in detail, but I've gathered an overview, and I'm really interested about your uh, statements on your skepticism around the solidity of memory. And I wonder if this also applies to collective memory. And has that influenced your work reconnecting with like historic food cultures?
Right. Well, memory strikes me um, as being subject to inflection. And you can testify to it yourself how in your dreams, the images that you experience in the world have been reshaped into different configurations. And the faces you passed in the day, pop up in different contexts and crowds in your dreams or stuff like that. And so, memory is slippery, but it's there. And I tend to think of it as multiple, that there are more than one, set of memories going at a given time. And so memory is modal, and we're able to have both personal and communal memory. Um, and um, you have recollective and recognitive memory. Um, so one of the things which is interesting is that you can't immediately conjure the smell of gingerbread
Mm.
sitting at where you are right now. But if you walk into a bakery and gingerbread is being cooked, you can recognize that it's gingerbread. Um, One of the really interesting things that neurogastronomers have um, determined is that, smells don't visit dreams because they're not recollective. You can't repackage them and just invoke them. Yet they exist in a past that is linked to linguistics. You can say, gingerbread. You've got the name there for it.
Mm.
So language has a peculiarly powerful mediating effect on memory that bridges both recollective and recognitive.
Is that one of the reasons why food is such a powerful touchstone for memory and culture? That it the way it interfaces with the mind is so different to sound and text and visual elements.
Oh, yeah, I entirely believe that. I think that the fact that, food isn't there in both the sense that you get hungry sometimes, but when you're not eating it, you can think about it, but you can't think eating it.
Hmm.
You can't create the flavor of fried chicken in your mouth to serve as, you know, a stopgap. So you go out seeking what you lack. Um, and the lacking makes the experiencing that much more piquant.
Mm, mm. Yeah, there's a significance there that it's it's difficult to define, but it's interesting to think about. I also wanted to ask if you think that the era of copyright, along with the era of privacy, is ending due to changes in technology, and where that might lead us.
Well, yes, although I do think that this is the age of global appropriation, where, the most powerful entities in the world or the most well-heeled billionaires can take and just take the literary creations of whatever and pocket them and process them as they wish. Um, and there's no political appetite, it seems, to break monopolies. So we have a kind of strange situation. But privacy, I don't think, is necessarily disappearing because privacy originally dealt with the privacy of one's own thoughts.
Hmm.
And while certain paranoid people think that the CIA may be broadcasting into their brains, um, uh, in actuality, you can think thoughts without people knowing what you think. So privacy remains. Certain types of private property are less tractable than they used to be. But one of the things that you'll notice is that human beings um, are quite ingenious about discovering new methods of privatizing things.
Mm, mm. Um, well, I'm interested too with this idea of piracy and copyright. That is it going to drive creative people away from digital media, like publishing books and novels, for example? Can you see people doing print-only runs and avoiding ebooks, even though that's a big sector of the market? It's also kind of like a poison chalice.
Yeah. I I don't know about that. A peculiar thing about the vanity of writers is that, on a certain level, they just want more people to read them.
Mm,
And and if it gets stolen, yet more people are reading them, that it's maybe, one quarter okay.
yeah. It's like if you've
Um,
got a peeping Tom looking in your window, it at least confirms that you're beautiful.
yes. So the psychology of people who publish to begin with, anything which maximizes public exposure may actually, satisfy that urge to be out there.
Mm,
That's a paradox, I realize, but and one of the things in terms of plants, for instance, the patenting of plants is a relatively recent um, innovation, and since sexual reproduction necessarily ensures that what you're producing is not the same as what pre-existed, it it sort of violates the the exact nature of what copyright intends to do. It protects your ability to do replica,
Mm,
to replicate and not, you know, procreate. So, so it's interesting that the first ideas about um, property rights associated with plants were associated with fruits that were asexually propagated,
mm,
you know, by cutting or um, by rooting.
mm,
And it was only later applied to crops that were um, uh, patented, and the nature of the protections for in the United States for plant patents, they're always more limited than in general copyright, um, because the public interest in having a food source always outweighs the private remuneration value.
mm. Um, I think we're on a similar page that we're wondering if the novel is uh, past its pull date as a cultural uh, artifact. And I wonder if there's parallels with what happened to poetry beforehand, that there was an era of asymmetric production, that there was elite creation of poems and there was a gate-kept distribution of poetry. But as paper got cheaper and literacy became more widespread, poetry stopped being an elite uh, pursuit and it became kind of democratized. And I think there was a like late 19th century, there was an era of poetry cringe where there was like so much bad poetry being made that nobody was even interested in the good poetry anymore. And I wonder if a similar thing has happened with novels in the age of self-publishing and ebooks, that the barriers are so low to production and the incentives are so perverse for anyone to curate, you know, those thousands and thousands of titles coming out like a fire hose, that the medium's kind of lost its place in culture, the novel that is.
Right. Well, you know, I was never greatly interested in the novel as a form. I guess I certainly read a number of them over the course of my life, and I do have interest in certain types of speculative sci-fi, you know, cyberpunk novels and things like that. And but you know, the problem with the novel is its plottedness, and when you have the same plots being reproduced, uh, you know, it's like on TV shows with plots. Sometimes you crave an eighth deadly sin because you've seen too much of the other seven at work.
Hmm.
Um, and and the reward punishment schemes that operate in novels, um, you know, they're so mechanical that you have to go to kind of matrix-like complexity to forgive, you know, the expectedness.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I have a son that is an opera director, and one of the things that always strikes me about opera is how cringy the plots of opera are, and how much I'm much more interested in the vocal calisthenics and the moment of emotion, and how little I'm interested in the actual sequences of revenge and malice that are being worked out.
It's a bit like the storyline in pornography. There's like some
Yeah,
attempt
well, I mean,
at setting a
is there a
scenario, but
story?
that's not really
Yeah,
the point.
yeah. The, you know, in poetry too, I think there's something else that has to be said, and that is a lot of the, the impulse to lyric has not in any way diminished. because it's a much more adventurous kind of mental activity to think figurally
Mm.
rather than in terms of cause and effect and plot.
Mm-hmm.
To seek the new metaphor or to wander through the similitudes that the world presents to you is a much more refreshing thing to do. And, what happens, I think, too, is that in the 20th century, popular song became the medium, the lyric
Mm.
became the most potent poetic medium in terms of actual power, cultural power.
Mm-hmm.
And the published poetry book became sort of like the theoretical exploration of horizons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there was, a bleed over where people are interested in what, you know, uh, popular songwriters are interested in what, you know, the avant-garde or the literary art poets are doing. Just like it was in terms of classical music and pop.
Mm-hmm.
When the Who became interested in, the minimalist Terry Riley and wrote Baba O'Reilly using, you know, O'Reilly's sort of synthesizer loops. So that was a kind of interesting thing to happen.
One thing I wonder with the novel is during the 19th century, when it was relatively new and more vibrant, that the way that individual writers went about creating those stories was very private and idiosyncratic. Whereas it's very tempting for people who are like, I want to write a novel today to do an MFA or to watch lots of courses or books, read books about how to write a novel, and it ends up being more standardized and explicit and uniform and less authentic, less sincere, less surprising, like down to its like basest level of DNA. Is that a possibility of what is causing novels
Right.
to lose their edge?
Um, well, I, it's difficult to generalize. Like when I think of 19th century novels, I think, one of the great attractions of the novels were its um, the power of capturing worlds which had heretofore been um, uh, prohibited from representation
Hmm.
by court cultures in Europe. And so, uh, whether in Dickens or in Thackeray or in Dostoevsky or in Dumas, you have the elaborations of places, classes of people. It's like Daumier, showing, uh, drawing for the mass market, the way that people riding in train cars looked,
Hmm.
just the ordinary people. And so that takes place over the course of the 19th century. So you actually get information
Yeah,
about the
you
world
get a glimpse
around,
into other lives and worlds that you would never previously have access to.
right? But, with the rise of photography, um, the visual representation becomes much more potent
Hmm.
and the literary much more taxing on people's mortal times. A photograph can convey that strange world almost instantaneously.
Mm.
So we had that function of the novel sort of eclipsed. And where the novel still operates is when it engages in world building of other worlds.
Hmm.
You know, I can remember reading Lord of the Rings in junior high school
Hmm.
and becoming absolutely embedded in this world of possibility that I had not entertained heretofore, that was logically consistent and rich, thick described, uh, but with human beings with, you know, reasonably intelligible motives for operation. So that's why speculative science fiction seems to be the place where novels still have a large following that is actually creative.
Hmm. 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 Uh,
It isn't certainly the romance novel or the mystery novel that
yeah,
is doing
yeah, yeah. They're becoming ever more automated. I
right.
think about the people who like to be in the business of writing mysteries or romance have to churn out another ebook every month to remain viable. It's like surely having AI take their job from them is a mercy.
Since I've never been in that slot, I'm glad that that's not an anxiety that devils me.
I could talk to you about this stuff for hours, but we should probably wrap things up. I have a fun final question that I like to ask everybody. If you could wave a magic wand and create a new life form, it might be a crop, since that's what you have worked with a lot, or it could even be resurrecting one that's been like long lost in your case. What would you want to wish into the world?
Um, I think, well, I've increasingly realized that fungus is the thing that is most consequential that people don't pay enough attention to.
Hmm.
Um, so I think a animated fungus is the thing I would like to see with mobility and intentionality.
Oh wow. Well, you completely surprised me with that answer, and I'm gonna have to stop and think about that one for a while. Do you want to round off letting people know where they can learn more about you, which books, and basically everything that people can track down? I'll put all the details in the show notes.
Right. Um, I'm David Shields. I can be reached through the University of South Carolina in the United States. I have a Substack called Food, Lore, and More. I've written 16 books. The ones on food include Southern Provisions, The Culinarians, which is the lives of 175 chefs in the United States from 1793 to 1919. The Arc of Taste, delicious and distinctive foods that define the United States, published by Slow Food USA. And I've got books on the history of silent motion picture photography, still on the culture of taverns and coffee houses called Civil Tongues and Polite Letters in British America, and about imperial poetry of the 17th and 18th century called Oracles of Empire, and about a bunch of other subjects too, but that's enough of a reading list.
Extraordinary, extraordinary body of work, and I highly recommend people look into that. So
I
with that,
am
oh yes,
now shooting a television show called The Savors of Flavor, which will premiere in May of 2026 on the national educational television in the United States.
I'm gonna have
But
to
it
put that
should
on
be
my
up
watch
on
list.
YouTube.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll put that on my watch list. That sounds fantastic. Well, with all of that aside, thank you, David, so much for what has been an amazing and surprising conversation. And thank you for all the amazing work that you do too.
Okay, well, it's been fun. I hope that the signal stability was enough that you can all hear.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you.
Bye bye.
If you would like to support my work, you can buy a paid subscription at my Substack and gain access to my past essays and my book, Taming the Apocalypse. Up next week, a chat with Professor Jiang of recent YouTube fame about Eastern view of civilizational collapse.